Welcome, everyone. To those of you who are here, you're going to need headphones. You need We're going to get rolling. You'll need headphones to hear. Perfect. Look at you. Please do. Oh, after Rena's presentation. Can you put a head? Trying again. Can you hear me? Yeah. I bet. Hit the power button. Okay, we're going to kick it off. And welcome to everyone. Was that a little loud? Okay, good. I'd like to welcome you to a really exciting event that we have to focus on subnational climate action, which is critical if we are going to achieve our collective climate goals. This issue is not unique to the United States, and many countries have found strength by building coalitions at the subnational level, particularly when federal politics shift. The U.S. is facing a significant shift in policies and politics, and we expect the incoming administration to step away from the domestic and international leadership role the current administration has taken. The America is All In coalition was built to lead if the federal government does not, and the history of the coalition shows the potential of a subnational movement built from the ground up and based on state, city, corporate, tribal, and climate leaders clamoring to coordinate to do more together. We're not in the same place we were during the first Trump administration. The coalition has been engaged in pushing for enhanced climate action for nearly 8 years. The Inflation Reduction Act has been under implementation for 2 years and now enjoys bipartisan support. 6 out of the top 10 states creating green jobs benefiting from the IRA are governed by Republicans. The climate legislation has created 330,000 new green jobs and invested over $360 billion in new clean energy projects across the country. There are 40 green banks, including the first national green bank across the United States, supporting community investment in climate-aligned investments, capitalized with billions of dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act. Local and statewide ballot initiatives focused on conservation and climate were often successful in municipalities and states across the U.S., and 45 states have submitted climate plans to access federal climate grants. It's important to know that states have tremendous power. We'll hear from some today. Federal climate leadership is very important, but so is subnational climate leadership. Now what I'd like to do is to welcome Rina Shui, Acting Director of the Center for Global Sustainability. Rina is an Associate Research Professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and Research Director for the Center of Global Sustainability. She's an expert in global coal transition, integrated assessment modeling, and international and national climate and energy policies. I'd like to welcome you to present your research.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Can people hear? Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to share our team's ongoing research about the important role of subnational climate action in the absence of federal leadership in the US, especially in light of the recent election outcome. This is a very important topic for us to discuss today. So just a little background to start. Our team at the Center for Global Sustainability at University of Maryland has been the analytical lead for the America's All-In Coalition, which Elizabeth already introduced in her opening remarks. Over the past 7 years, we have developed a solid analytical toolkit that can explicitly represent the non-federal policy actions in the U.S. climate pathways. And through our research, we have demonstrated the important role of non-federal action in the U.S. So the toolkit has several important components I want to highlight. First, we have built a collective policy platform that through a really extensive stakeholder consultation process. Also, as an example, earlier this year, we have conducted 12 listening sessions in partnership with the All-In Coalition with their numbers, just to present our preliminary research about the U.S. Pathway to a high ambition 2035 target. And we got really important and valuable input from the members about the policy assumption, also to better understand how the numbers came out together. It's a very innovative process we run this year in leading to understanding the national target. The second component is by using a field-leading open source integrated assessment model, also with 50-state resolution of the U.S., we can explicitly model detailed policy action at the non-federal level. As part of the scientific community, we also document our assumptions, methods in different type of publications, including peer-reviewed journals. Great. I think I do want to give a quick recap of the analysis we published in our September report that launched in at New York Climate Week, where we developed a high ambition all of society pathway towards a U.S. 2035 target. Well, with the new context, those pathways will be updated, but I think those two numbers will provide some context about the numbers we'll talk later. So we have current policy scenario that reflect all the existing on the books policy in the U.S. at both federal and non-federal level that can deliver a 48% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2035 compared to 2005. And then the enhanced ambition scenario that include new policies at all levels in the U.S. that will deliver a 65% reduction by 2035. As I mentioned, the election outcome gonna add uncertainty to the federal climate policy agenda landscape. This may likely shift both the executive and legislative agendas, as the Trump administration already signaling potential federal inaction or rollbacks in climate policy. This may affect a number of things, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, also the recently finalized EPA regulation on power plants, and also fossil fuel power plants, and also tailpipe emissions and others. However, at the same time, some policies are more robust than others. For example, the IRA, it's an investment-focused law that requires both executive and legislative support. It also provides incentive for all the consumers, and we do observe a lot of high uptake in the Republican and swing states, so hopefully will also attract bipartisan support under the Trump administration. And also some of the fundings already allocated and transferred to state, those are really hard to retrieve. So we do acknowledge federal leadership is critical, but also at the same time, the role of non-federal actors in the U.S. has been have been very important, and also will be increasingly essential to maintain the momentum in the U.S. to keep the national and global climate goal moving. This is because the policy authority, there are a lot of policy authorities at the subnational level in the U.S. To actually accelerate transition across all the sectors. Here, the table shows some of the examples we explicitly modeled at the subnational level in our pathways. You can see that it's across all the sectors across the economy. I'll just give a few quick examples here. We won't go through all of them. In the electricity sector, over half of US states already have renewable portfolio standards, RPS, or a similar policy equivalent that has pushed renewable deployment really successfully. So in our enhanced ambition scenario, we're going to see expanded RPS adoption that will also push to a coal phase out by 2030. Also, regional initiatives like the RGGI also have been very effective in reducing emissions in the power sector. In the transportation sector, we also already see a lot of states adopt the advanced clean car to advanced clean trucks, provide incentives for electric light-duty vehicle. In our enhanced ambition, we'll see a wider adoption of those policies across states. At the same time, there can be policies to help reduce the service demand, to reduce the vehicle miles traveled in the transport sector. So by modeling that, also in reality, we also see increasing non-federal leadership, the strong market forces. There are tremendous demand, public demand of renewable clean technology in the US. We see a lot of investment go to the sector. So really the transition is already happening, and also the clean technologies are here to stay. So it is crucial to understand the important role of non-federal actors that pick up some of the slack, that fill the gap that left by federal government, and continue on the high ambition pathway. So our preliminary analysis, we also included in our September report that have a first cut of the potential rollback from the federal level, shows two scenarios. If the federal government keeps all the current policy in place, but does not adopt any new policies beyond that, with the continued enhanced subnational action from state, city businesses, we can achieve a 60% reduction by 2035. So comparing to the 65, this is a really impressive number. And then if the recent climate legislation regulations, including the IRA, are completely removed, which is unlikely, as we discussed earlier. This continued non-federal action, enhanced non-federal action, can achieve a 48% reduction, which is also accidentally the same number as the current policy can achieve, which also is very impressive. So in the report, we also laid out concrete implementation pathways for the subnational leaders to take a set of concrete action across the individual sectors. So just go through them quickly. In electricity, I think we do observe the success of renewable deployment in the US. There is some issues related to siting, permitting, which are at the local level to kind of help overcome and further expedite the process for renewable deployment and integration. In transport sector, I think EV infrastructure is very important. That's enabling factor for EV adoption, in addition to the incentives. Also mentioned the sustainable planning, being able to help reduce vehicle miles traveled. In buildings, energy efficiency have a lot of potential, can be achieved by the energy efficiency standard, also focus on electrification, heat pump adoption, zero emission appliance, zero emission buildings. Similarly, industry have a lot of potential for energy efficiency improvement, both through incentives or policy tools like the energy use intensity standards. Last but not least, want to highlight methane, which we all know has a lot of potential to help reduce the near-term warming, which probably global level is our best kind of most effective lever to focus on the temperature peaking limit that the overshoot, so we can still have a pathway to come back, return to 1.5. And also methane, it's an emission source from all different sectors, particularly in the oil gas sector, to set up methane sensitive standards, to have leak detection and repair programs. But at the same time, in the waste sector, also manure management, those policies also can deliver a lot of benefits to the local environment, which is a high priority with the local at the local level. So my last slide, just want to also give information about the ongoing in-depth analysis we're doing on this topic. So we're looking at additional scenario to understand the emission impact with a different level of federal rollbacks. We kind of provided two possible bonding scenario, but there's more in-depth discussion. We can look into the federal rollbacks. We're also looking at further enhanced non-federal climate action beyond what we already modeled. There's also possible federal re-engagement in the future. Beyond that, beyond the greenhouse gas emission, we are also developing new methodology, new analysis to quantify the broad societal benefits of the low carbon transition that's more resonate strongly with the subnational leaders, such as reduce air pollution, improve public health, get well-paid clean jobs, boost our economy. So all of that will send a very strong message to all the leaders to take more action on this. With that, I think that's the end of my presentation. Really thank you for your attention. I will pass back to Elizabeth. I really look forward to our excellent panel for the discussion. Yep.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you, Rena. As you can see, there's a tremendous amount of work that can still be done. And we are really lucky to have a partner in the University of Maryland Center for Global Sustainability that just keeps us grounded in the science, which is critically important. So next up, what I'd love to do is to introduce and then invite our panelists up. Serena McElwain is the Maryland Secretary of the Environment. Go ahead, thank you. She was confirmed as the Maryland Department of Environment's 11th Secretary in March of 2023, and prior to this appointment, she was the Undersecretary of California's Environmental Protection Agency. A native of Washington, D.C. area, McElwain also served in the federal government as a senior executive for numerous executive branch agencies, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as Assistant Regional Administrator for Region 9 in San Francisco. Thank you for being here. Anna Leasing. Senior Climate Advisor for the Office of Governor Jay Inslee. Washington State, Anna Leasing is a Filipina immigrant and mom of 3, 2 humans and a dog. I like that. As Governor Inslee's Senior Climate Advisor, she develops and leads Washington State strategies to fully decarbonize the buildings, transportation, and power sectors. Thank you for being here. Yana Garcia. Thank you. Yana Garcia was appointed California Secretary for Environmental Protection by Governor Gavin Newsom in August of 2022. In this role, she leads California's climate efforts, protects air and water quality, oversees pesticide and toxic regulation, and advances environmental justice. Eric Holdsworth. Eric is a leading expert on the issue of global climate change with over 30 years of experience in the field. Currently, he's Managing Director, Clean Energy and Environment at the Edison Electric Institute, where he helps oversee EEI's involvement in the global climate change issues. Thank you all very much for being here. Are we okay on technology? Yes? Almost. You can hear me, so that also works. All right. Yeah. If you can. All right, while Eric's getting that rolling, Secretary McElwain, I'd love to go deeper. I mean, the analysis that Rena presented is really critical for us to sort of keep in the back of our minds, but narrowing in on the state of Maryland, If you could speak to some of the specific sectors that states and companies are doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As mentioned in the presentation, methane has a critical role to play in limiting near-term warming. Tougher methane controls at landfills can have a sizable impact on methane emissions, and Maryland is one of the states leading the way in going beyond current federal regulations. Can you please discuss Maryland's approach and plans for combating methane emissions?
Hello, thank you. Very good question, and I always love to brag a little bit about Maryland. So, in terms of methane, methane is really one of the biggest issues we have in Maryland. But the two areas that really affect us in terms of methane are the landfills as well as landfills. Well, let me just talk about the landfills first. With landfills, the biggest problem that we're seeing is food waste. It is a lot. And we're really trying to figure out a way to divert that waste to other organic recycling centers. We do have some regulations where, like big companies, big food companies, they are required to divert the food waste if it's within 30 miles from their facility. So that's one of the areas and one of the ways in which we are making sure that we're trying to get ahead of methane in that area. The other area is agriculture. Oh my goodness, the agricultural waste in Maryland is really an issue. I'll give a quick example. In Maryland, in terms of chicken litter, we are diverting 220,000 tons of chicken litter outside of Maryland. I'm hoping they're not in trucks going down the highway, but it is diverted. And so we're looking at ways to use, in terms of when you look at the circular economy, so we're looking at ways of using that waste in terms of using like anaerobic digestion systems. So we're partnering with different companies to see what can we do to turn that waste into energy, biogas energy. So those are really the two big areas for us that it's really areas that we really are trying to get a handle on. We also have nation-leading regulations. Like, for example, we require companies to detect and repair landfill leaking gas pipes, and so that's something that we are making them do or having those companies do. So that's really how we're trying to approach the methane problem that we have in Maryland.
Thank you. Meeting Maryland's ambitious climate goals requires action in its largest emitting sector, the transportation sector.
Yes.
What policies is Maryland putting at the forefront to combat that issue?
We have a lot of policies when you think about transportation. I have my colleague here from California, so obviously we are following California when it comes to advanced clean cars too, as well as advanced clean trucks. So we are part of the, I think, 16 states that follow California. So we are and that's one of the first things I did when I became secretary, is make sure that we were following the ACC too, because at that point we had stopped for political reasons. And so we're definitely pushing hard on transportation regulations. We're, in terms of EV adoption that we're talking about, we're also pushing a lot of incentives so that we can move the market. We're using, of course, the federal funds and state funds as well. So that's pretty much how we're really trying to make a difference in the EV area. I'll add one more piece of information. In Maryland, we have about 6 million cars on the road, and we have over maybe 120,000 EVs. So we're trying to get that number up. And so it's going to take us really a lot of effort with Maryland pushing that.
Yeah, and it's so interesting as you draw on the various tools, whether it's federal, whether it's state-to-state learning, and sort of policy adoption. There's so many different ways that you can really move things forward. So thank you for that. Anna, over to you. Tell us about the results of the ballot initiative. This was something that we were, I think, all watching very closely, as you were, of course. What does that result mean for Washington State? and the region, the country, and the world. Clearly, this was sort of a monumental initiative that the governor really leaned into. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being here and joining us in this conversation, and thank you to America's All In for hosting us. So for folks who are not familiar with our Washington State's Climate Commitment Act, which is understandable, I don't know why you'd be necessarily paying attention to state policies, it is a cap and invest program where we actually, by law, require the state to reduce economy-wide our emissions 50% by 2030 and then net zero by 2050. But in addition to setting a strict and enforceable limit on greenhouse gas emissions, we actually also use the revenue generated from the cap and invest system to reinvest into communities in Washington State. We actually distribute 40% to overburdened communities and another 10% to tribal nations. We have a strong indigenous population in Washington State, so we're making sure that the investments that we're making are not only mitigating carbon emissions, but also addressing historic injustices done to overburdened communities in our state. This was a really big deal. So we actually had a conservative billionaire self-fund an initiative to repeal our climate law. They basically just wanted to make sure that the polluters would no longer have to pay for the health impacts that they were causing to Washington residents, and we knew that if they were successful, it would send a pretty strong, chilling signal to other states who are also considering similar carbon markets in the U.S. There's been a very intensive effort to make sure we fought that ballot initiative. I'm happy to say that Washington voters actually resoundingly defeated the initiative. We won the ballot initiative by 62% of the vote of Washington. So it was a pretty definitive message back to conservatives that we do very much care about climate action and we're taking it seriously in Washington State. And we know that's been a strong signal to other states that we partner with who are also considering carbon markets. This is something that we're very much eager to preserve, and so we were happy to see the initiative knocked down because it's also generated $3.2 billion in new climate investments in Washington just in the past 2 years alone.
That's really awesome. And I have to say, just to tie it back to the panel, we had a panel just before this where, excuse me, folks were talking about the presidential election and sort of what that means for climate. And more than one referenced the fact that there is not a mandate for the incoming president to be anti-climate, and there is definitely a movement that will continue pressing forward. And of course, there is evidence that voters, in fact, really do want to move forward on climate, and certainly in polling and other things. So I'm going to move on to the transportation sector, if that's okay, unless you want to come back on that one.
I just want to kind of double click on that a bit, in that these are policies and laws and regulations that states can make. Look, there's no sugarcoating that what happened in the elections in the U.S. last week are really concerning and, quite frankly, pretty jarring for a lot of us. And what does that mean also, for the climate movement in the U.S.? But I want to point to this win, the Climate Commitment Act. While it was good for Washington State, keep in mind that those are very real enforceable programs that states can continue doing. There's nothing that the federal government can do to pull that back. The same thing with our building codes. It's same thing with our power sector when we're talking about 100% clean electricity requirements. Same thing with our transportation requirements. All those investments, in the U.S., the vast majority of energy policy is made at the state and local level. And so while we absolutely would love to have a strong partner at the federal government, make no mistake that states and cities are continuing to show up.
Absolutely, and that's why this pavilion exists and why we're all committed to the work. The transportation sector is currently the largest sort of source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and Washington has been achieving record levels of EV adoption rates, particularly coming from Maryland. What is Washington State's strategy for accelerating EV adoption?
So we've been doing a couple of things where we again also have adopted California's regulations where we are requiring 100% passenger vehicles to be sold to be electric vehicles by 2035, and that gradually we're gradually increasing the sales requirements leading up to 2035. So we want to make sure that as that is becoming the default choice for Washington drivers, that we are prepared and making that transition as convenient and seamless as possible. So we've actually invested quite a lot of state resources to build out a statewide public charging infrastructure. And we map out where there's kind of charging deserts, where we need, where we see vehicles registered, where there's demand, et cetera. But we also, saw that Paris had launched a program, a social leasing program for electric vehicles, and we said this is what we need to be doing. We need to be focused on how do we make this transition accessible and convenient for everyone. So we invested state resources to actually provide with no upfront costs EV leases to Washington drivers that we actually can get over a dozen different types of electric vehicle models for less than $200 a month. For context, in the US, the average monthly lease rate is $500 a month. So this is significantly cheaper. There's actually also models available for $56 a month. So it is increasingly accessible for folks who don't have necessarily the upfront capital to take advantage of the federal tax credit. And the federal tax credits do also stack on the state program that we've developed.
That's wonderful. And I saw Secretary McElwain sort of lean in on that. I don't know if you want to come back on that, sort of this, state to state.
Yeah, I was very interested in hearing what you were doing to promote EVs, and I'm going to have to take some of those ideas back to Maryland, because that's really incredible. We're having a hard time getting the numbers up yearly. They are increasing from where we used to be. We were at a very low percentage, like 1.5% per year. Now we're at like 20-something percent. So that's a big increase.
Yeah.
But we need to do more marketing, and we have a lot of some of the feedback that I'm getting from, probably most of you can relate, is the fear, the range fear, and that we don't have a lot of infrastructure in place for charging, but we do. And so it's that message that we're trying to just get the numbers up. So yes, I will steal some of what you said. Thank you.
Great. Yana Garcia, I'd like to come to you. Secretary Garcia, California is a leader in climate action with bold and ambitious policies, as well as results. In your view, what are some of the leading approaches that California has undertaken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thanks for all the work, definitely from my fellow colleagues and all of you who are engaged in this space. First, before I begin, I do want to also double click on the need for hope and the need to kind of keep this momentum going, regardless of who is in charge in the White House. And that goes for not only the United States, but also for our fellow other nations. We've had some really successful conversations with colleagues in Brazil, certainly leading up to COP30, who are also trying to Bolsonaro-proof their own work at the state level. And we've seen so much activity with so many of them during that administration, as we will continue to see with so many of our states, cities, and municipalities in the United States as we move forward. So tackling a little bit of the built environment, and some of this is similar to our colleagues in Washington in terms of the revenue generation that we've seen from our cap and trade program, which now a decade in implementation, a decade plus, has been really successful in terms of not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also creating a pot of funding for money that goes to climate investments, but those that give us co-benefits, right? So in California, we actually have a housing crisis. I shouldn't say actually, everybody knows that. Many of our fellow states suffer from the same, and I think there's a global housing crisis. There's increasingly, understandably, pressure on the expenditure of any public dollar to leverage the ability to build more housing. And of course, we have to do that cognizant of, as the presentation noted earlier, VMT reduction. And so one of the best things I think that we've been able to do in terms of investing our cap and trade dollars is to build infill development. Since 2014, we have invested $28 billion in our climate investments programs. 70% of that has gone to disadvantaged and low-income communities. That's gone to a lot of investments in transportation, including electric vehicle rebates, but a lot of it has also gone to infill development, transit-oriented development, expanding and creating new transit corridors for people to build connectivity that reduces VMT, but that also addresses other areas of lack of opportunity, inadequate access, equity issues, and housing issues. And so I think that's one of the ways that we've been able to leverage our climate investments to help solve other, quote, kind of non-climate issues. I mean, I would posit that housing access is in fact a climate issue. It is a climate challenge. As long as people continue to have inadequate access to housing or are living in substandard housing, they will be at the brunt of the impacts of the climate crisis and will be moving because of that. So we've seen a great deal of success in that, and we'll continue that moving forward.
And I wondered if you just could take a minute to talk about the VMT for those who aren't familiar with the concept and the acronym.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry about that. VMT, vehicle miles traveled. So as we are looking at expanding electrification, as we're looking at driving down emissions from the transportation sector, which for us in California accounts for over half of emissions in our state, we have to also consider not only the type of vehicle, not only the combustion engine, and for us in California, we have a directive by executive order to have all new vehicle sales by 2035 be 100% electric, but also thinking about how we build connectivity and reduce the amount of time and miles that are traveled in any vehicle. We know that, at least for us, new vehicle sales are not all vehicle sales. There's a healthy and significant used car market in California. There will continue to be that used car market. That used car market is also overwhelmingly used by low-income communities. And we cannot continue to have low-income communities driven out of our urban areas, having longer commute times for their own health and benefit, but also for the benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about VMT reduction, it's part of what we're talking about in terms of the levers that we're pulling to address the climate crisis.
And my next question, actually, you alluded to this, is that on public health, what is the connection between climate action, public health, and how do you think about that and make sure that they are sort of supporting each other and considering both issues?
Yeah. I have to know, I'm so appreciative that we're at a place where I think for the most part we accept that we can talk about climate from the standpoint of health improvement and air quality as well. For a long time in California, and I think elsewhere, we were so narrowly focused on carbon emissions to the detriment, I think, of many communities who are struggling with the immediate impact of toxic air pollutants. And what we have seen year after year after year is if you drive down non-carbon air pollution, you will also create carbon improvements, right? And you will also drive down greenhouse gas emissions. You will also help solve the climate crisis. So I'm very happy that we're now in a place that it's not a dichotomy in that respect. I think what we've seen in California, particularly in the focus of our climate investment strategies in disadvantaged communities, is that when you focus on reducing air pollution in hotspots, you are driving the best sort of win-win-win all around. You get greenhouse gas emission reductions, you get health and air quality improvements, you get more school days for school children, you get less absences because of asthma and ER visits, you get more people able to go to work, you get increased health cost savings. And I think these are some of the ways that we at the state, local, and municipal level have to think about our climate investments and have to think about our climate strategies, because for so many of us, we're not only dealing with the climate crisis, we're dealing with an economic crisis, we're dealing with a health crisis, and certainly during the pandemic, I think we saw a heightened focal point on respiratory illnesses, on the relationship between air pollution and those respiratory illnesses, and an increased focus on the need to address those respiratory illnesses through all ways in which we could. And so I think what we've seen in California has really been an improvement in how we're thinking about climate, how we're moving the needle with a focus on health. And the last point I'll make, just in terms of addressing some of the reliance on fossil fuels, our economy-wide scoping plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 requires a 90% reduction in fossil fuel use and consumption. Most of that we're driving down through the transportation sector, but many of you may know this, California is historically a significant oil-producing state, and so we've really had to ratchet down our production of oil. We also had a referendum in California, unsuccessful, to pull off of the books a law that would have created health-based setbacks between oil and gas facilities and communities. And that was something that was pushed for by many communities who are suffering the brunt of air pollution burdens and of other pollution burdens, as well as the climate crisis, and was something that we saw as an opportunity to improve health outcomes, but also meet our climate goals. And so we're really happy about having beat back that referendum, but something that really showed us that you can have this multitude of benefits with reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, reducing our production of fossil fuels, with health at the center, and with reducing air pollution at the center as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that was really a wonderful example of sort of all of these different policy goals sort of coming together, and congratulations on beating back the referendum. Eric, since 2005, excuse me, EEI member companies have reduced emissions reductions by approximately 41%. I'm going to take this off. You can hear me? Okay, I'll get you a new pair. Even without binding regulations from the EPA, what are some of the main forces driving these reductions, and how are EEI and its member companies working to surmount the challenges of decarbonizing the power sector?
Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you so much for the question. It's really a pleasure to be up here with three such distinguished leaders on a panel, and to be the only guy. I like that. Usually in the old days, too many mantles, so it's good to have a nice, diverse panel. Thank you for the question, because one of the things we're proudest of in the power sector in the United States is our ability to have reduced emissions 41% below 2005 levels as of last year. All of that in the absence of binding federal regulation. And how have we done that, right? Well, through a combination of areas, right? Part of it has been declining costs for cleaner technologies, and we've been able to do that. We've also leaned in hard. I would say all of our members have made long-term carbon reduction commitments, the vast majority of which are net zero by 2050 or earlier. And so in doing that, they also noted that we were going to need, advanced development technology. So we leaned in hard on IIJA and IRA with many of the stakeholders in this room to get that critical legislation passed, and that can help us going forward. But we've been able to do it really through this combination of finding, well, of course, declining cost renewables, increasing availability of natural gas, and let's face it, a lot of pressure that the industry has heard quite clearly about the need to reduce our emissions. And I think that's, to me, in this whole kind of looking forward process, the North Star for me. We've been able to do this, right, because we're driven by a number of different factors, right? We have a lot of stakeholders, investors, other forces out there pushing us to get to net zero, and so that's really become the industry's North Star, while trying to maintain, of course, affordability and reliability of electricity, which is critical. But by having that kind of vision, by implementing those technologies, by working with stakeholders, in meeting some of the federal, state regulations, that are out there, all of that has helped us see, and of course, in reducing our carbon. And I'm glad that you noted the transportation is the number one source, because we love to say we used to be number one, we're number two, we'd like to be number three and maybe number four, and we're working on that. But we've also like to make the point, right, that our decarbonized electricity, as we get that cleaner, we don't need to wait for that to get to zero. We can be implementing that across the economy. So it's great to hear the conversations and the efforts on electric vehicles. And we've leaned in really hard with OEMs, with states, with others to get help address the range anxiety, right, to help make sure the charging stations are out there. So really trying to lean forward and be able to continue to move forward by doing that, but really responding to a lot of different forces to help drive that down.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, of course, EEI's role in influencing the IRA and the IIJA. Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Um, how has federal and non-federal climate leadership contributed to transforming the U.S. energy sector, but also then think about how have EEI member companies utilized funding and policies to deliver high amounts of clean energy?
No, appreciate that. Yeah, and that's really, when, like I said, we were strongly behind passing the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act because we knew that those could help us unlock the next generation technologies. While we've reduced a lot, and there's certainly more that we can reduce using current technologies, I think everyone's acknowledged that, at least in our industry, that we're going to need some additional technologies to get there. So leaning in on those and now trying to work with the funding that's out there from DOE to get the deployments, to get the demonstrations, to get the research going, to help bring those to commercial affordability as soon as possible so that we can then bring those onto the system. I say the other thing that we're finding too, right, in this world now of trying to bring on these new technologies, collaboration has become a really critical factor for us, right? And so not just the power sector by itself trying to do this, but now realizing we need to work out and work with the Googles, the Microsofts. We need to work with our states. We need to work with a wide range of stakeholders to help mitigate some of the costs and risks of these technologies so we can bring them onto the system, and again, by trying to emphasize the benefits of decarbonized electricity and spreading that out. So whether it's through transportation, the built environment, a number of other areas where we can bring decarbonized electricity, that's all going to help us get to net zero, right? And we've been, I say the other piece of this, as I noted earlier, is that we've been able to do this to date, in the absence of federal regulation. Even in the 2016 to 2020 period, those emissions continue to come down. And that's where we're headed as an industry, right? Continuing to implement and deploy those kind of cleaner technologies driven by a wide range of forces. But I think there is a lot that we can do. We're doing some of that collaboration, and I think we're really starting to find the benefits of that, about how can we all work together to overcome some of these next hurdles. We've done a lot, right? But there's a lot more to go. How do we overcome those hurdles collectively? And I think all of us realizing we're in this game together, and so we're really going to need to, as opposed to kind of being in a opposite relationship, I think all discovering that if we work together, we can help drive a lot of these policies and implementation faster and get us to zero in a quicker time frame.
Yeah, no, that's very important. As Rena had laid out in the analysis, and this is a question really for anyone, so you can see who wants to jump in first. The CGS, the Center for Global Sustainability report suggests that significant emissions reductions can be made even in the absence of strong federal climate leadership, which really results, as shown, in a 60% reduction in 2035. What specific actions or policies from various sectors will have the most impact over the next 4 years? Many of you spoke to where we have come from and the progress we have made, which is critical, right? What's next? Where do we go next? And what does that look like over the next 2 to 4 year period, let's say?
I'll say that decarbonizing the building sector is number one. I think we need to go hard in that area. In Maryland, it represents about 16% of emissions. But like in Maryland, we need to continue to push forward on building energy performance standards. We're pushing that in Maryland. Clean energy heating standards, zero emission heating equipment standards, all of these different policies that we can push out as a state. We don't have to get permission to do that from the federal government. And I think it's really important that the states look internally and see what can we do without, I call it the mother may I. You just get those policies out, and again, in the next 4 years, we are going to be looking internally, looking at our state laws to make sure that we're utilizing the power that we have to make sure we decarbonize the building industry in particular.
So I think we know the roadmap of how to cut emissions from our three kind of major emitting sectors: transportation, power, and buildings. Obviously, we don't have it fully mapped out to get us to net zero quite yet, but we know that it's not enough to just electrify vehicles. Back to Secretary Garcia's point, right? Like, we need to be looking at land use and housing, and how do we use that more efficiently, because if we cannot reduce vehicle miles traveled, then there is no way we're ever going to get to net zero on transportation, point blank. Buildings, we have the building performance standards to help reduce emissions from the existing building stock. We have building codes in Washington State. We have building codes that have effectively, eliminated the need for gas in all new buildings. That took effect last year in our state. But there's just so much more we need to do in terms of thinking creatively. Power sector, we have 100% clean electricity standards. We need to expand beyond that. So, we have to start thinking about, in the power sector, what do we still use from fossil fuels? How do we work with utilities, actually particularly gas utilities, to be able to transition them to be energy providers? Not electric utilities, but just energy providers. What is the service you are trying to provide to your customer? How do we do that in a zero emitting environment? And then same thing for buildings. As we are actually building out our building stock, how are we doing that as efficiently as possible? How are we creating communities that are, actually increasing public health benefits, that are meeting folks' needs and prioritizing that, and trying to think a little bit beyond this very singular focal point of these are the different investments we can make or policy levers and mandates that we can put for reducing emissions in that particular sector. If that makes sense.
Sorry, you made me think of something. One other area that's really important for Maryland is we import like 42% of energy from different states. So we use more energy than we produce. And the energy that we're getting from other states isn't necessarily clean energy. And so we need to, in Maryland, start thinking about power purchase agreements with the utilities so that we can kind of demand that the energy you're giving us is clean energy, because it's important. The other sort of on a pie is we have about 42% from nuclear energy in Maryland, and very little in solar, and very little in wind, like 2.7, 1.3 respectively. It's that low. And so we can't afford to have the 40% that's coming from outside states to be dirty energy. So we're really looking in that area as well.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll start with what I think the regional and municipal governments can do. First, on regions, through the federal investments, the influx of federal investments over the past year, the South Coast Air Quality Management District in California, LA region, very significant region. Much of the state lives in this region. It's also somewhere where we have serious air pollution burdens. Did receive $500 million to decarbonize our ports and to work on deploying heavy-duty electric vehicles. And I think one of the successes that we're starting to see in our port districts and in partnership with some of the cities in which they are partnerships with other shipping ports and creating green shipping corridors. And that's something that leverages government, leverages private investment, and can really drive down emissions from shipping and goods movement, freight transport. I think the other thing that Secretary McElwain mentioned, I think is also really important, is the focus on methane and waste reduction, reducing our waste in landfills, really ratcheting down how we're thinking about waste generally. Our path to carbon neutrality is not a waste neutral path. I think another co-benefit of reducing vehicle miles traveled is you don't have to produce as many vehicles, period, and you are creating less waste by doing that. We can't assume that we're solving all our problems by getting all the ZEVs on the road either. And so really thinking about circularity and how we are building and catalyzing a truly circular economy. Creating secondary uses, thinking about our waste as an emission source, because it frankly is. I mean, so many of our fossil fuel companies are pivoting to producing plastic, and we're not going to meet our climate goals if we continue to produce plastic the way we're producing it, and certainly not if we're continuing to put it in our landfills. So focusing on that as well at the regional municipal level. And then finally, I think at the state level, we've learned through the various iterations of our scoping plan that our natural and working lands cannot continue to be a source of emissions. And so thinking about the various levers that we have to reduce emissions from natural and working lands, including agriculture, partnering with growers, partnering with farmers. For us in California, we're a significant ag producing state as well. And so creating incentives to reduce emissions from agricultural production and food production gives also a multitude of benefits, creates food security, builds resiliency in this economy, and also allows us to bring down emissions, of course, through the agricultural sector, as well as conserving and preserving so many of our ecosystems and nature-based solutions.
I'll just add real quickly. On the power sector side, obviously, we feel like decarbonizing power is a critical element, but I think in our view, right, it's because it helps us unlock a lot of other sectors. So we've already talked about electricity and EVs, right, but our members are also very heavily invested in the hydrogen hubs, which would have the potential to, use hydrogen for those hard-to-produce heavy equipment, heavy machinery. That's, one example. Our members are also very involved in trying to use landfill methane waste and create renewable natural gas from that. So trying to turn a negative into a positive. Right? Members are now starting to invest in things like advanced geothermal. So in our view, right, obviously a little self-centered with the power sector. We think getting to zero is the most important thing, but because we feel like that helps us really unlock these other sectors and can be a critical factor in helping other emitting sectors get to zero, in addition to the other policies that have been outlined here.
Thank you very much. I have about 45 more questions, but we only have 2 minutes. And so I wanted to see if anybody else had a question for any of the panelists, but it has to be short. May I borrow that? Thank you.
Thanks. First of all, I just want to commend your leadership representing Denmark. We're very concerned with what's happening on the US side, and the leadership you're showing is very reassuring. One of the issues that we have worked with is on the government side, being able to expedite the way we do permitting. We were lucky enough that the project we have done in Denmark with the Danish EPA has found its way to the CEQ report to Congress on digital permitting. So my question to you is, are you looking into this? Because if it's EV chargers, if it's new grid, if it's solar panels or offshore wind farms, this is perhaps the most important roadblock to achieving this. And there are actually some very good recommendations in the CEQ report based also on the work we've done in Denmark, and we're very happy to share that with you. I know we already are working closely with the Cal EPA and are obviously interested in working with others.
So permitting reform in 1 minute. Who's got it? Anna.
I'm so glad you brought up siting and permitting, because that is actually, I had thought to bring it up earlier and forgot. So thanks for asking this question. This is something that we've been working on for the last few years very intently. It's been actually Governor Inslee's big focus has been on how do we actually site and permit new clean energy. For context, in Washington State, we are actually expecting 30% electricity growth in demand in the next 10 years, and then expecting our electricity demand to double in by 2050. That means that we have to bring a lot of new generation online very quickly. We have a kind of a historic centralized siting facility council in Washington State, but it was created for siting nuclear power and reactors, right? And so it's kind of more designed to try to reduce harm, and we have been working on reforming that to be able to have the primary mandate be, you need to go figure out how to build new clean energy generation. You need to figure out how to make these projects go forward, still with the same environmental regulatory requirements to make sure that we aren't inadvertently doing harm in other ways, but basically reorienting the mandate of this centralized state permitting council. And that is to help streamline the permitting process within Washington State, because otherwise you will have to go through various local jurisdictions in order to get that done. Another side of this coin is transmission. And so for us, in our region, we have a federal agency that actually is responsible for our transmission, but the interconnection queues are years long. So we are actually developing legislation right now to create our own state transmission authority. What we would be able to provide financing to be able to build out and meet that new transmission capacity that we know is already in the queue, so that it's ready once we have the new clean energy generation to come online.
take 30 seconds
You
on
bet.
that. Really appreciate the question. And yeah, for our industry, that's a huge issue, front and center permitting and siting reform. Even if we can make the grid more efficient, we're going to have to build additional grid in the future. If it takes you 7 to 10 years to get a transmission line built, I can't tell you how many clean energy projects that destroys the financing for, right? And those projects then can't come online because the investors are like, I had that money 5 years ago. But so it's really important for us. We've really tried to lean in hard. And when I say permitting and siting reform, it doesn't mean trying to avoid, any of that. It just means it has to be more efficient, a little more streamlined. If you knew that you could do it in 2 or 3 years, it just helps unlock financing, certainty, all of that. So it's a huge issue, something we're trying to lean in hard on ourselves on a national basis as well.
I am really impressed. Oh, go ahead. Last.
I'm just going to say thank you for hosting a delegation from California. I learned so much in Denmark. And I think the lessons we're learning in permit streamlining for renewable energy are also super instructive for water storage, groundwater recharge for us in an arid state like California, and for housing.
Secretary McElwain, last word.
I know you only had 2 minutes, but I could not. I had to thank you again for bringing that up. We, all of us, all states, all subnationals, all of us have a problem with permitting, and we need to improve. But I think this might be an opportunity for all of us, all states, just work together and see how we together can maybe solve that problem. Because again, it's not a one-state problem. We're trying to reform permitting. We've been hearing from our governor, from the federal government about how long it takes to get a permit. The bipartisan infrastructure money really demonstrated that we have a real problem with permitting because a lot of those companies were not able to build the infrastructure they needed because of NEPA 2 and permitting. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. Really, each of your stories is inspiring, and I saw sparks going off among you. So thank you for being here. This is what a subnational climate movement looks like. Join us for the rest of our programming. Rena, thank you so much for presenting on this really critically important analysis and for all of you being here. Thanks very much.